Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories coming your way. And if you enjoy videos like this, check out the others on the channel and share them with someone who loves a good story. The cold settled into the thin metal walls of the van long before dawn, creeping across the sleeping bags and secondhand blankets like a force with its own slow patience. Lauren Miles felt it before she opened her eyes, sensed the stiffness in her neck and the tight, familiar ache behind her temples. She didn't move at first. Movement meant acknowledging the day had started, and most days in the last year held little promise beyond the obligation to make it through to the next. Her son, 8-year-old Eli, was curled beside her on the narrow mattress they'd fashioned out of old foam pads and folded quilts. He slept deeply, the way children do when exhaustion becomes a constant companion. Lauren watched his breath plume faintly in the cold air and gave herself a few more seconds before pushing the blankets aside. Life in the van had its rhythms now, rhythms she followed because routine created the illusion of control. She reached for the small camping lantern, turned it on, and winced at the pale glow that revealed the cramped interior. Clothes stuffed in plastic bins, a few canned goods in a cardboard box, a pair of shoes drying near the heater that no longer worked reliably, and the familiar sight of the windshield fogged over from the cold Colorado night. She checked the fuel gauge mentally before even glancing at it, because she always knew approximately how much they had left. Enough for today, maybe tomorrow, if she didn't drive too far. Enough to survive, if that could be called surviving. Eli stirred when she shifted her weight. His eyes blinked open slowly, unfocused at first, then narrowing against the lantern's glow. He gave her a small, sleepy smile. "Is it morning?" he mumbled, though the answer was obvious in her expression. She nodded and smoothed his hair, the gesture as automatic as breathing. Morning meant they needed to start moving before someone noticed they had parked overnight behind the library again. This town wasn't particularly harsh toward people in their situation, but one complaint could lead to a conversation Lauren wasn't prepared to have with authorities. The fear that someone would question her ability to care for her son was more chilling than any mountain night. Once Eli was bundled in his jacket, she opened the driver's door and let in a blast of cold air that bit at her face. Frost clung to the windows of the surrounding cars. A few locals were already inside the library building, early risers who came for warmth, Wi-Fi, or a quiet space before work. Lauren envied their normalcy. She wiped the windshield with a rag kept under the seat, started the engine, and waited as the van vibrated with the first reluctant shudder of life. The heater sputtered uselessly. She tapped it, knowing it wouldn't help, but habit was hard to break. Driving through town, she passed the grocery store where she had once worked unloading trucks and stocking shelves. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it had been steady. Rent had been barely manageable back then, though the numbers never quite added up. When the layoffs came and her hours were cut, she had asked for more shifts, pleaded for anything that could give them stability. Instead, she'd been let go along with a handful of others, names on a list that meant little to people who didn't see the faces behind them. With no family to fall back on and no savings to cushion the blow, their slide from precarious to homeless had taken only a few weeks. She remembered the eviction notice taped to their apartment door, the look in Eli's eyes as she tried to explain why they could no longer live in the place he called home. The van had become their shelter out of necessity, not choice. At first, she told herself it was temporary, just until she found another job. Then the weeks stretched into months, and survival became an intricate balancing act of fuel, food, odd jobs, and finding places to sleep where no one would question them. The library had become their sanctuary, one of the few places they could go without drawing attention. Lauren parked the van in its usual spot and ushered Eli inside, grateful for the warmth that hit her as soon as the doors shut behind them. The smell of books, clean floors, and quiet activity was oddly comforting. Eli headed to the children's section, where the librarian smiled at him without asking too many questions. Lauren sat near an outlet, plugged in her phone, and opened the job listings she had checked dozens of times already. Most options required experience she didn't have, background checks she was afraid to undergo while living out of a vehicle, or transportation she couldn't afford. After an hour of fruitless searching, she leaned back in her chair and rubbed her forehead. Her eyes drifted to the community bulletin board near the restrooms, a chaotic mosaic of flyers for yard sales, tutoring services, music lessons, and community meetings. She had skimmed it before, usually without much hope. Today, a clean white paper pinned slightly off-center caught her attention. It stood out because it looked official, crisp against the faded layers beneath it. County tax sale, the heading announced. Beneath it was a list of locations and minimum bid amounts for properties seized due to unpaid taxes. Most starting bids were far beyond anything she could dream of paying, but one address, near the bottom, made her pause. The photo next to it was small and grainy, but clear enough to catch her breath. A structure built into a rocky mountainside with a metal roof and sections disappearing directly into the stone. It looked abandoned, strange, almost otherworldly. And the minimum bid was only $220. Her first reaction was disbelief, then suspicion. Properties sold at tax auctions often came with steep debts, structural damage, or complications she wasn't equipped to handle. She had read enough warnings to know these sales were risky. Yet something about that picture lodged itself in her mind. A home carved into a mountain, sheltered from the harsh winds and storms that battered the region. It looked weathered, but solid in a way the van never could be. She imagined, for a fleeting moment, what it would feel like to sleep inside actual walls again, to have a door that locked, to give Eli a place where he didn't have to wear a coat to bed. She tore off one of the small tabs with the address and auction date. Her heart beat faster than it had in months. It felt reckless, irrational, even foolish to consider the possibility, and yet the idea grew with each passing second, becoming a tiny flame against the darkness she lived in. She knew better than to trust hope, but hope had a stubborn way of resurfacing, especially when she wanted to protect her son. Back in the van that afternoon, Eli opened a worn comic book while Lauren studied the auction flyer again. She read every line, searching for the hidden catch. There were plenty, of course. A tax lien that needed clearing, unknown repair needs, the impossibility of predicting what they would find if they did win the property. She didn't have much money. What she did have would barely cover the minimum bid, let alone additional costs. But as she looked at Eli, his legs tucked under him to stay warm, she felt something shift inside her, an insistence that they deserved a chance, no matter how improbable. For the next few days, Lauren pushed herself harder than she had in months. She collected aluminum cans from trailheads, rummaged through recycle bins, and sifted through scrap yards to sell whatever metal she could find. She parted with the last of their items of value, a set of tools from her father that she'd hoped to save, a few pieces of jewelry from her childhood, anything that could be exchanged for even a few dollars. She chose routes where she might find more returnable items instead of where she could conserve fuel, and prayed each time the van started that it would last long enough to carry them through the week. The closer the auction came, the more terrified she became. What if she succeeded in gathering enough money only to be outbid by someone wealthier? What if the house was uninhabitable? What if pursuing this opportunity made everything worse? These questions chased her through sleepless nights, but behind them was something stronger, an instinct she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't recognize it immediately, but eventually she understood. It was determination, resurfacing after months of numbness. On the morning of the auction, she woke Eli early. The sun had barely risen, and frost clung to the windows. She layered him in sweaters and jackets, packed a small bag with snacks and water, and drove toward the county building. The parking lot was already half full when they arrived. She felt out of place the moment she stepped inside. The lobby buzzed with conversations between people who looked confident and well-prepared. Some wore suits, others held clipboards or portfolios. Lauren held only her envelope of carefully counted money and the number she'd been assigned at registration. The auction room was brightly lit, rows of chairs facing a podium where officials shuffled papers. Eli sat beside her, his wide eyes scanning the crowd. Lauren squeezed his hand, unsure whether to reassure him or herself. Properties flashed by quickly, each announced by location and starting bid. Numbers were called out with casual ease by bidders who didn't flinch at thousands of dollars. Lauren's stomach twisted as she listened. Everything felt surreal, like she'd stepped into a world that wasn't meant for her. When the mountain property appeared on the screen, the room's energy shifted almost imperceptibly. Several people glanced at one another with amusement or mild disbelief. One man in the back shook his head as if the listing were a joke. The auctioneer announced the starting bid, and silence settled across the room. Lauren's heart pounded. She lifted her number slowly, almost fearfully. For a moment, no one else moved. The auctioneer glanced around, waiting. Lauren felt each second stretch into a fragile eternity. Then, finally, the hammer came down with a decisive thud. The property was hers. She felt no triumph, no rush of elation. Instead, she felt something like vertigo, a dizzying mixture of relief and overwhelming responsibility. She didn't know whether she had just saved them or made the single worst mistake of her life. Eli looked up at her with a smile that was both surprised and hopeful. Lauren managed to smile back, even as her world pivoted sharply around her. Whatever awaited them at the mountain property was unknown, but for the first time in months, the unknown felt like possibility rather than doom. The van had been their cage as much as it was their shelter. The house might be ruinous, but it stood still, anchored to something solid, and she needed that solidity now, even if she had to build it with her own raw hands. When they stepped out of the county building into the bright morning light, Lauren held the small packet of paperwork in one hand and Eli's fingers in the other. Her grip on both felt fierce and instinctive. She didn't know what they would find in that mountain house, only that this was the direction their life now pointed. Survival had been their goal for so long that hope felt foreign, but she sensed that something had shifted irrevocably. They had a destination now, and the fragile beginnings of a future shaped not by chance, but by a decision she had dared to make. The road toward the mountains unwound before them like a worn ribbon, narrowing the farther they drove. Lauren kept both hands tight on the wheel, guiding the van up the shallow curves, the engine straining with the climb. The morning sun had already lifted beyond the horizon, but in the shadow of the towering ridges, the light felt muted and distant. Eli sat upright in the passenger seat this time, leaning forward with anticipation as the landscape shifted from open plains into clusters of pines and sharp, jagged rock formations that rose like frozen waves. Lauren had expected the property to be remote, but the deeper they ventured into the foothills, the more she realized just how isolated it truly was. The paved road gave way to a rougher dirt path that rattled the van and sent tremors through her nerves. She checked the directions again, tracing the route on the crumpled flyer she had laid across her lap. It seemed simple enough on paper, but the reality of following an old fire road through unfamiliar terrain was more daunting. She worried the van might not make it. She worried about what would happen if it broke down. She worried about everything that she couldn't afford to worry about anymore. Yet, despite the tension knotting her stomach, she felt a strange solidity inside her that hadn't been there before. The decision had been made. The property was theirs now, for better or worse, and the only way forward was straight into the unknown. She thought about the silent auction room, the way no one else had raised a number for the strange house built into the mountain. Part of her feared she had walked into a trap. Another part of her dared to believe she had found something no one else recognized for what it could be. When they reached the final turn, the road curved abruptly into a narrow ravine. The van lurched and groaned as it navigated the uneven terrain. Fallen branches and shallow ruts forced Lauren to drive slowly, her eyes darting between the path and the rocky slopes rising steeply on either side. For minutes at a time there was no sound except the low hum of the engine and the ticking of gravel against the undercarriage. Then, around the last bend, the house appeared. It rose out of the mountain like a forgotten relic, half hidden by rock and brush. At first glance it didn't look like a house at all, but a strange hybrid of man-made structure and geological formation. A slanted metal roof clung to the upper portion, rusted at the edges and appearing as though it had not been touched in decades. Below the roofline, wooden panels marked the outer face of the building, many of them warped, broken, or missing entirely. The rest of the structure vanished directly into the mountain, the stone forming part of the walls, the ceilings, even the depth of the rooms within. Eli gasped softly, and Lauren felt her own breath catch. The photo from the flyer hadn't done the place justice, or maybe it had been too generous. From this close, the house looked far more battered than she expected. One of the exterior support beams had split and tilted dangerously, leaving a section of the roof bowed under its own weight. Several windows were either shattered or missing. The ground around the building showed signs of erosion, with patches of loose dirt and small stones gathered in piles where they had been washed down by storms. Still, despite its ruinous state, there was something striking about the structure. The mountain seemed to cradle it, holding it against its stony heart. The design, whatever remained of it, had been intentional once, practical, sturdy in a way that only necessity could inspire. Someone had carved out a shelter here long ago, using the permanence of stone to create what must once have been a remarkable refuge. As Lauren parked the van in the small clearing that passed for a driveway, she let her hands rest on the steering wheel for several moments. The journey had left her both exhausted and invigorated, nerves buzzing with adrenaline and fear. She knew they couldn't afford to waste time. Winter was creeping closer every day. The mountain air already carried a crispness that hinted at early snow. "Is this it?" Eli asked quietly, turning toward her with wide, uncertain eyes. Lauren nodded, holding on to that moment of honesty between them. "Yes, this is it." They stepped out together, their breath rising in faint clouds. The air tasted sharp, clean, unlike anything in town. Lauren felt her steps sink slightly into the loose earth as she approached the main entrance. The front door was crooked in its frame, weathered and swollen from years of exposure. When she pressed her hand against it, the wood felt spongy in places. She pushed gently and was surprised when the door swung open, with only a muted groan. The interior swallowed the daylight almost immediately. The smell hit her first dampness, dust, something medicinal buried deep beneath the layers of time. She switched on her flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness, revealing a room that had once been an entryway or receiving area. Now it was a tableau of decay. Broken wooden chairs, rusted metal cabinets, and piles of debris lined the walls. The floorboards near the door sagged under her weight, forcing her to test each step before fully committing to it. Eli stayed close behind her, his flashlight darting across the walls and ceiling. The membranes of old spiderwebs shimmered faintly, undisturbed for years. A cluster of medical crates lay open near one wall, their contents long removed, but still bearing faded labels hinting at their original purpose. Lauren moved deeper into the room, her boots disturbing dust that seemed to cling to the air. She had expected damage, but seeing the reality was harder than imagining it. The house wasn't just old, it had been abandoned, neglected, forgotten. The idea that someone once relied on these rooms felt almost incomprehensible now. It was difficult to picture warmth or safety here, only the stark evidence of time and weather stripping it bare. Still, she couldn't deny there was structure beneath the ruin. The stone walls carved into the mountain were solid. The deeper they moved into the belly of the house, the cooler the air became, but more stable. The rooms cut directly from rock had maintained their integrity better than the wooden sections. The floors there were uneven but firm. The ceilings bore no rot. Here and there, remnants of shelving and fixtures clung to the walls, suggesting where supplies might once have been stored. Lauren traced a hand along the stone surface. It felt cold, but dry. A good sign. If they could clear out the debris and heat these inner rooms, they might be livable, at least temporarily. But the wooden sections would need attention, serious attention, and she didn't know where to begin. She found herself mentally cataloging every damaged piece, every repair they would eventually need. A sagging beam that required replacement, a section of roof that leaked, the broken front entrance, the absence of any working utilities. All of it stacked into a towering, impossible list, and she felt the weight pressing hard against her chest. The enormity of the task threatened to crush her resolve. Eli, meanwhile, had wandered carefully into what looked like a narrow corridor leading deeper into the mountain. "Mom," he called softly, his voice echoing. "Come look." She followed, her light playing across the uneven stone floors as the corridor dipped slightly. The walls here were smoother, almost polished by time or repeated touch. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, one that immediately felt different. The air here smelled less damp, and the dust in the room was undisturbed, as though sealed away until their arrival. In the center of the chamber stood a pile of wooden planks, old, weather-worn, but not as broken as those near the front entrance. But it wasn't the lumber that drew Lauren's eye. It was the partially collapsed ceiling beam that, when shifted, revealed the corner of something metallic. Her heart quickened. She stepped closer and knelt, brushing away debris. The metallic object was a strongbox, rectangular and clearly aged, its surface mottled with rust. It had been wedged between the fallen beam and the stone wall, preserved almost by accident. Lauren hesitated for a moment, then grasped the edges of the box and tugged gently. It slid free with surprising ease. Eli knelt beside her as she set the box on the floor. The metal was cold to the touch. The latch was stiff, but intact. She worked it loose, and with a reluctant click, it opened. Inside lay the past, kept alive in ink and paper. Neatly stacked journals, their covers worn but intact. Folders with official-looking documents. Photographs, black and white images depicting families, children, men and women standing beside this very mountain house when it was alive with purpose rather than ruin. The faces were solemn, hopeful, tired, grateful. Lauren sensed stories behind every photograph captured in those brief, still moments. Carefully, she lifted the first journal. The handwriting inside was elegant, steady, belonging to someone who had written with intention and clarity. She flipped through a few pages, reading pieces aloud in a near whisper. The author introduced herself as Dr. Marilyn Flynn, a physician who had operated a mountain refuge here during the darkest years of the Great Depression. She described patients she treated, families she sheltered, the harsh winters that forced her to rely on scarce supplies and unwavering determination. Each entry painted the mountain house not as a ruin, but as a sanctuary carved out of desperation and compassion. Lauren's throat tightened as she read. She imagined the doctor working tirelessly in these rooms, the echo of footsteps against the stone, the way this place must have once been filled with voices and warmth. It was almost impossible to reconcile those images with the desolation surrounding her now. She flipped further until she reached the final pages. The handwriting grew shakier, the lines less steady. In the last entry, Dr. Flynn wrote a message to whoever would one day find her journals. She feared the house would be abandoned after her death, its purpose forgotten, swallowed by the mountain, but she hoped fiercely that someone in need would someday discover it and revive its mission, that the house would again be a place where those who had nowhere else to turn could find refuge. By the time Lauren finished reading, her hands trembled. The weight of the moment settled heavily on her shoulders. She felt the significance of what she had stumbled upon, the strange convergence of her own desperate circumstances and the doctor's fading hope recorded decades earlier. It was as if the mountain itself had waited patiently for someone to return and remember. Eli pressed his shoulder gently against hers. "This place, it was important," he said softly, like it meant something. He was right, and the realization left Lauren both inspired and overwhelmed. She closed the journal and returned it carefully to the box. The idea of restoring this place felt monumental, impossible, yet the idea of walking away felt equally unthinkable. They spent the remaining daylight exploring the rest of the house. Much of it was uninhabitable in its current state, floorboards that needed replacing, beams that needed reinforcing, rooms that needed sealing. But the core of the house, the sections built directly into the mountain, held potential. If they cleaned and insulated them, they might have at least 1 or 2 rooms warm enough to survive the winter with a portable heater. By late afternoon, exhaustion set in. They returned to the van to eat and rest, deciding to sleep in the vehicle one more night before attempting to move anything inside. The sky darkened quickly in the mountain shadow, and the temperature dropped swiftly. As they lay under their blankets, the mountain loomed silent and steady around them, the house hidden in its protective embrace. Lauren closed her eyes, the echo of the doctor's final entry lingering in her mind. A house built not just from stone and timber, but from intention and care, a place meant to shelter those in need, a place she had found at the exact moment she needed shelter the most. For the first time in months, sleep came to her not as an escape, but as a quiet acceptance of a new beginning. She did not know yet how they would manage the repairs, the costs, the enormous effort it would take to make the house livable. She did not know how they would survive the winter, or if they could, but she knew they were meant to be here, that the house had offered them something she hadn't felt in a long time: possibility. She drifted off with the image of Dr. Marilyn Flynn in her mind, a woman who had once stood where she now stood, facing hardship, isolation, and impossible odds. A woman who turned a mountain into a refuge. Lauren wondered if she could do the same, if she had even a fraction of the doctor's strength. The night wrapped around the van. The wind howled through the ravine, but the mountain stood unmoving, and the house waited patiently for its next chapter to begin. Morning came quietly in the mountains, not with the bright fanfare of sunlight cutting across an open horizon, but with a slow, creeping illumination that seeped into the ravine and softened the darkness. Lauren awoke before Eli, as she often did, lying still in the cramped van and listening to the faint rustle of wind brushing over the metal roof. The air inside was cold enough that her breath hovered in the dimness. For a few moments, she lay there staring at the ceiling, the weight of the previous day pressing gently but insistently against her mind. The house they had explored lingered in her thoughts like a half-formed dream, unnerving, broken, yet full of a history so profound it seemed to hum beneath the stone walls. A place that had once held lives, pain, hope, and now held the fragile beginnings of her own. She lifted herself carefully so as not to wake Eli. The ache in her back felt more pronounced than usual. a reminder of weeks spent sleeping on improvised bedding and months of perpetual tension in her body. She rubbed her eyes and reached for the lantern, letting its warm glow fill the van. For a moment, she regarded her son, his hair tousled, his arms curled toward his chest, his face peaceful in a way she rarely saw during the day when worry peeked from behind his every expression. She brushed a hand lightly along his shoulder, the tenderness steadying her before she stepped outside into the morning chill. The mountains loomed above them, austere and magnificent, bathed in a pale, fragile light that made their jagged peaks appear almost blue. Lauren hugged her jacket close against her chest and walked toward the house, studying it with clearer eyes now that sleep had rinsed away the haze of the previous evening. It was possible to admire the structure from a distance, its peculiar shape, the way it was tucked neatly into the mountain like an intentional secret. But up close, the damage seemed more daunting. She saw the bowed roof, the sagging boards, the rubble scattered near the foundation. It was not a house so much as a carcass awaiting either rescue or burial, and she could not yet be sure which fate she was capable of giving it. She had always believed that fear grew strongest in stillness, and as she stood in the cold morning air contemplating the overwhelming task ahead, fear tried to slip into her thoughts. She forced herself to turn away from the exterior and return to the van to begin preparing breakfast. Today had to be a day of action, not of paralysis. They needed food in their bodies before taking on what lay ahead. When Eli awoke, he helped her make oatmeal over the small portable stove, huddling close to conserve heat. Together, they talked about what needed to be done first: clear out the front rooms, start planning for repairs, create a space they could live in, even if it meant sealing off most of the house for the winter. The enormity of the task seemed less frightening when she broke it into pieces aloud, especially with Eli listening intently, nodding with a seriousness well beyond his years. They spent the day hauling debris out of the entryway. The work was slow and physically demanding. Each step had to be taken with caution. Lauren didn't want to risk a foot going through the weakened floorboards. Dust clouded the air and settled on their clothes, hair, and eyelashes until they both looked like they had aged a decade. The more they cleared, the more the bones of the house showed themselves. Underneath the broken furniture and mildew-stained boards, there was an undeniable structure that remained intact: the stone corridors, the carved rooms, the solid foundation created by the mountain itself. By mid-afternoon, they had successfully cleared enough space to lay down temporary boards along the safer sections of the floor. It wasn't perfect, but it meant they could navigate without fear of sudden collapse. In the deeper rooms carved from stone, they discovered a few metal shelves still bolted to the walls, their surfaces rusted but stable. Lauren wiped them down with an old rag, imagining storing food or blankets there once the rooms were clean. But even as progress began to show, the reality of what lay ahead crept into Lauren's mind. The property needed far more than elbow grease and determination. It needed tools, lumber, insulation, wiring, plumbing, things that cost money she didn't have. She had known this when she bid on the house, but knowing something and facing it up close were different matters. The dread she had been keeping at bay slowly resurfaced, threatening to steal her momentum. As the sun dipped lower, she found herself thinking of the journals they had discovered the day before. The words left by Dr. Marilyn Flynn carried a weight that transcended time. They spoke of a purpose rooted in compassion and resilience, not convenience. Lauren felt that same call tugging at her now, urging her not to shrink back. When they settled down in the van that night, exhaustion pressed down on her body like a heavy blanket. But despite her fatigue, sleep eluded her. Instead, she reached for the old journals and a flashlight, reading by its soft beam while Eli slept beside her. The more she read, the more vivid Dr. Flynn became, a woman determined to provide refuge in the face of insurmountable hardship. The doctor's entries described the people who had found shelter within these walls: miners injured in accidents, families whose homes were destroyed by blizzards, travelers lost along the mountain roads. Each entry painted a portrait of need met with unwavering resolve, and in reading those stories, Lauren began to understand the depth of what this house once represented. It had been a sanctuary in a time of crisis, a place where those who had fallen through society's cracks could regain their footing. Closing the journal, Lauren felt tears burn at the edges of her eyes. She imagined Dr. Flynn in these same rooms, walking the same corridors now coated in dust and ruin. She felt the ghost of that doctor's determination settling over her like a gentle hand on her shoulder. It was not a command, but a legacy offering itself to her. The weight of her own circumstances felt slightly less unbearable as she drifted into a light, restless sleep. The next morning brought a new challenge: finding a way to secure even the most basic materials needed to begin repairs. Lauren knew she couldn't lift the house out of ruin alone, but she didn't know who might help or how to even begin asking. She was so accustomed to fending for herself that the thought of turning outward for assistance filled her with dread. Yet she understood that without help, she and Eli might never escape the cycle of survival. The mountain refuge needed help, and in return, she hoped it might help them survive the winter. She made the decision to walk into town once more. They left early, leaving the van parked near the house, and trudged down the rugged path toward the main road. The walk took nearly an hour, their breaths visible in the crisp morning air. Town felt strangely distant, as though it existed in another world entirely, yet its familiar sounds and smells greeted her with a surprisingly warm sense of relief. She headed straight to the library, carrying a few of Dr. Flynn's documents in a plastic bag for protection. A kindly librarian noticed Lauren's uncertain posture near the reference desk and approached gently. Lauren explained she was looking for information on local assistance programs or historical funding that might help restore an old property. The librarian listened quietly, then pointed her toward the local newspaper office, located just a few blocks away, explaining that the editor there often wrote stories about forgotten sites and community projects. Lauren hesitated, anxious about stepping into the public eye, but the encouraging expression on the librarian's face gave her the courage to try. The Beacon Ridge Chronicle office occupied the second floor of a modest building above a pharmacy. The climb up the narrow wooden stairs made her heart race, not from exertion, but from the uncertainty of what she was about to do. When she reached the door, she stood frozen for a moment before knocking. A man in his 60s with silver hair and glasses perched on the tip of his nose opened the door. He introduced himself as Frank. His eyes conveyed curiosity rather than dismissal, and that alone made it easier for Lauren to speak. She explained her situation gradually, choosing her words carefully. She told him about the property, their circumstances, and the journals she had discovered. At first, she braced herself for judgment or disbelief. Instead, Frank listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions. When she showed him a few of the documents and photographs from Dr. Flynn's belongings, he grew visibly more intrigued. Her story had a gravity to it that no reporter could ignore: a forgotten medical refuge, a hidden corner of local history, a mother struggling to rebuild a life for her son in the very house that had once sheltered the desperate. Frank asked if he could write a piece about her discovery and the history behind it. Lauren hesitated, but eventually nodded. She had nothing left to lose. The article ran 2 days later. When Lauren returned to the mountain after another arduous day of cleaning, she found a small group of people standing near the house. For a moment she panicked, thinking someone had come to tell her the house was condemned or that she had violated some regulation. Instead, the visitors introduced themselves as locals who had read the article. They carried toolboxes, gloves, and even small bags of groceries. A few brought blankets. Others had building materials in their trucks. Lauren felt her throat tighten. These were people she had never met, people who owed her nothing, yet they had come simply because they wanted to help. One of the men, a contractor named Robert, stepped forward and explained that he specialized in structural assessments. He offered to check the integrity of the house, focusing first on the most damaged areas. Another volunteer, a retired engineer named Clayton, inspected the mountain-facing walls for signs of dangerous erosion. A woman named Hazel brought food and supplies and immediately began organizing them in the van so Lauren and Eli would have easier access. As the day progressed, more volunteers arrived. Word of the article had spread quickly through the small town. A group of teenagers came with their teacher, offering to clean out debris and help with basic repairs as part of a community project. The grocery store owner sent up boxes of canned goods and bottled water. Someone donated a portable generator, and another person dropped off rolls of heavy-duty plastic sheeting to temporarily cover exposed areas of the roof. Lauren stood by watching these strangers work, her emotions caught between disbelief and gratitude so overwhelming she had trouble finding her voice. She had expected pity at best, indifference at worst. Instead, she found herself at the center of a collective effort she never could have imagined. With every beam lifted, every board replaced, the house seemed to awaken just a little further. The silence of abandonment that had clung to it for years slowly dissolved into the rhythm of hammers, saws, and human voices. That evening, as the volunteers packed up their tools and prepared to leave, several promised they would return the next day. One of them mentioned that the local historical society had taken an interest in the house and wanted to send representatives to assess its eligibility for historical preservation status. They believed that, if Dr. Flynn's refuge could be officially recognized, funding and resources might become available to restore it properly. Lauren could hardly comprehend the sudden shift in her circumstances. She looked at Eli, whose eyes sparkled with excitement as he helped stack some leftover materials near the van. This was what hope looked like: messy, unexpected, and entirely overwhelming. True to the volunteers' word, the next days unfolded into a whirlwind of activity. Representatives from the Historical Society arrived, armed with clipboards, cameras, and archival documents. They confirmed the authenticity of Dr. Flynn's journals and connected several details with old municipal records and newspaper articles from decades past. They walked through the house with reverence, touching the stone walls as though sensing the stories embedded within them. Some portions, they concluded, were remarkably well preserved, considering their age. The sections carved into the mountain were especially significant, representing a type of emergency medical refuge rarely documented in this region. When they informed Lauren that they believed the house could qualify for historic status, she nearly sank to her knees. With that designation might come grants that could help with the major repairs she couldn't afford. It might also lead to a reconsideration of the tax debt still looming over her. One of the society members, a woman named Lydia, assured her that many counties waived or reduced tax burdens on newly recognized historical sites. The possibilities were dizzying. Lauren had spent so long calculating fuel costs down to the last dollar that the idea of receiving thousands in restoration funding seemed surreal. Meanwhile, the volunteers kept returning. Some offered advice on plumbing and wiring. Others focused on replacing compromised beams and sealing gaps in the exterior walls. The generator brought intermittent power to a few tools and lights, making it easier to work in the deeper rooms. Slowly, the house began shedding its abandoned shell. The sound of human activity echoed through its corridors once again, echoing faintly off the stone like the whisper of a memory revived. Lauren, for the first time in months, felt something expanding inside her that she had been too afraid to let grow. Purpose, not just survival, but a reason to endure that extended beyond herself and her son. She worked alongside the volunteers, learning how to handle tools she had never touched before. Her confidence grew with each task she completed, whether it was securing a beam or patching a crack in the stone. She began to feel the weight of her life shift, not away from hardship, but toward a strength she hadn't known she possessed. At night, when she sat in the van reading Dr. Flynn's journals, the doctor's challenges and triumphs felt like a parallel she never could have anticipated. She imagined the doctor navigating the harsh winters, tending to the injured with limited supplies, and fighting for the survival of her patients. Those entries became a lifeline for Lauren, guiding her through her own exhaustion and uncertainty. The tax burden still haunted her thoughts. It was a debt she could not hope to pay alone. But as the Historical Society completed their assessment and drafted their recommendation for preservation status, hope shimmered just ahead. If the county agreed to forgive the debt, the house could truly become theirs, not a precarious asset dangling above disaster, but a home they could rebuild without the fear of losing it. Then, one crisp morning, Lydia from the Historical Society arrived with news that left Lauren speechless. The county had approved the designation. The house was now officially recognized as a historic site, and in accordance with long-standing policy, the tax debt had been forgiven in full. The relief that washed over Lauren was so profound that she found herself crying openly, her breath coming in uneven bursts. Eli hugged her tightly, not entirely understanding the complexity of the situation, but sensing that this moment marked a turning point. The feeling that surged through Lauren was not simply relief, it was freedom from the crushing weight she had been living under for so long, freedom from the fear of losing the fragile beginning they had carved out here. The house no longer hung over her like a precarious gamble. It had become something real, something she was allowed to believe in without reservation. With the debt cleared, the energy around the project seemed to intensify. Volunteers felt the triumph as though it were their own victory. The Historical Society accelerated their efforts to secure emergency grants for structural stabilization. The local hardware store began donating materials regularly. Even people who hadn't met Lauren came by to drop off items they thought might help: a spare heater, a box of screws, a set of used but functional power tools. As the weeks passed, the house slowly transformed. The roof was patched enough to keep out the rain. Temporary insulation went up in the stone rooms. The front entrance was rebuilt with sturdy beams and a door that actually closed. The corridors were swept clean of debris, revealing the rough but solid craftsmanship beneath. The deeper rooms, carved directly into the mountain, became warm enough to sleep in once portable heaters were introduced. For the first time since arriving, Lauren and Eli slept inside the house rather than the van, lying close together on makeshift bedding, feeling the protective embrace of stone around them. It was during one of those nights, with Eli sleeping peacefully beside her and the house resting in rare quiet, that Lauren finally allowed her thoughts to drift beyond the present moment. The journals remained spread around her like a mosaic of inspiration. She reread passages that described families seeking shelter, people rebuilding their lives, and moments of small triumphs amidst great adversity. The parallels between their stories and her own struck her deeply. A thought began forming inside her, gentle at first, then growing more certain as she traced the arcs of the former residents in Dr. Flynn's writings. This house had once been a refuge in the truest sense, a place where the broken and displaced could regain their footing. Why couldn't it be that again? The idea rooted itself in her mind with startling clarity. She could transform the house not only into a home for herself and Eli, but into a sanctuary for others, a transitional space for families facing hardship, a safe haven for those with nowhere else to go. She didn't know exactly how to structure such a place or what it would require legally or financially, but she felt a deep conviction that Dr. Flynn's legacy should not be left to the past. It should evolve. It should live on. As she lay beneath the soft light of the lantern, With the steady breath of her son beside her and the vast mountain encasing them both, Lauren understood something with absolute certainty. She was no longer simply surviving. She was beginning to build, and the house, with all its scars and history, was the foundation on which she would build not just a home, but a mission. The next chapter of her life and the life of this refuge was no longer dictated by fear or circumstance, but by a hope grounded in action. The mountain had guarded its secrets for decades. Now it had offered her a purpose she had never dared to imagine. The house would shelter again, and she would make sure of it. Spring arrived in the mountains like a slow exhalation, thawing the hardness of winter and softening the world one careful inch at a time. The snow that had clung so stubbornly to the higher ridges began to shrink, leaving behind narrow streams that traced silver paths down the slopes. Pines awakened with a deeper shade of green, and the wind carried less bite and more promise. But even as nature loosened winter's grip, Lauren felt the season shift inside her even more profoundly. What had begun as an act of survival, purchasing a forgotten house buried in a mountain face, had grown into something that resembled purpose. Not yet solid, not yet fully formed, but unmistakably real. The house now breathed with a different energy. It no longer felt like a hollow ruin. Instead, it felt like a place stretching after a long sleep, its stone corridors warming, its rooms reclaiming life little by little. Volunteers still visited, though less frantically than before, as the worst of the structural work was finally complete. The emergency grant from the Historical Preservation Board had funded repairs that Lauren would never have been able to afford in her lifetime. The new reinforcement steel beams, hidden expertly within the wooden framework, freshly poured concrete supporting the back rooms, modern waterproofing behind the stone walls meant the house was no longer in danger of collapse. The most urgent threats had passed. Now, the work ahead was quieter, more deliberate, more personal. Rooms needed furnishing. Common spaces needed purpose. The remnants of Dr. Marilyn Flynn's journals had awakened in Lauren an idea that kept her awake at night. It was no longer a whisper. It had become a steady pulse beneath everything she did. The refuge would be reborn, not as a medical outpost or Depression-era shelter, but as a transitional haven for modern families in crisis. Families like hers, people pushed to the margins by circumstance, bad luck, or a single financial misstep. People whose lives could change if someone simply gave them a safe place to land. The thought loomed both inspiring and terrifying. Running such a place was not simply a matter of goodwill. It required structure, legal standing, partnerships with local agencies, and more planning than she had ever done in her life. Yet each obstacle seemed to push her further into conviction rather than deter her. This was what the house wanted, what Dr. Flynn had laid the groundwork for decades before, and Lauren, standing now on a foundation strengthened by community and history, felt obligated to move forward. She spent late winter drafting ideas in the quiet hours after Eli fell asleep. Sitting near the small heater in the carved stone bedroom, she wrote long lists in a spiral notebook, lists of needs, tasks, questions she didn't know how to answer. She outlined the types of support families would require: temporary lodging, job placement help, school stability for children, basic necessities like food and clothing, emotional support from social workers or counselors. She listed what she could offer immediately, which was little more than space, warmth, and a willingness to try. But she reminded herself that Dr. Flynn had once begun with even less. Some evenings, she reread the journals, particularly the passages where Dr. Flynn wrote about the first families she sheltered. Those pages radiated a profound empathy that seemed to transcend time, and Lauren often found herself pausing to absorb the weight of the doctor's determination. More than once, she whispered a quiet promise into the stillness of the stone room, as though the walls could carry her vow to the woman who had written so passionately within these same walls nearly a century earlier. She promised to honor that legacy. She promised to try. The turning point came in March when Lauren attended a monthly town hall meeting in the modest community center at the base of the mountain. She had never spoken at such a gathering before. In fact, she still felt self-conscious moving through town at times, aware that many knew her story from the article that had circulated months earlier. But the same townspeople who had read her story had also given their labor to restore the house. She owed them honesty about her vision. It was time to share the next chapter. She sat nervously in the back of the room until her turn came. When her name was called, she walked toward the podium with her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. The room fell quiet in a way that made her pulse roar in her ears. She glanced at Eli sitting in the second row beside Hazel, the volunteer who had become something between a friend and mentor. His small, encouraging nod steadied her more than anything. Lauren began by recounting the house's recent restoration and the community efforts that had made it possible. She spoke about Dr. Flynn, about her refuge during the Great Depression, and the records that chronicled her work. Faces in the audience softened as Lauren described the place the house had once been, a sanctuary in dire times. Then she explained her idea, reopening the refuge as a transitional shelter for families struggling through homelessness, displacement, or personal crisis. She emphasized that it would not be a handout, but a stepping stone. Residents would contribute through chores, upkeep, and community participation, just as Dr. Flynn had expected of her guests. They would receive guidance towards stability, not indefinite reliance. She outlined her preliminary conversations with a few social workers she had met in town, who confirmed there was a growing need in the region for temporary housing that didn't resemble overcrowded shelters or long-term government facilities. She spoke about the rooms in the house, how there were more than she and Eli could ever use, and how letting them sit empty seemed a disservice to the history and potential of the place. The room remained quiet, but not in a way that made her feel dismissed. Instead, she sensed an attentive curiosity. People were listening, truly listening. When she finished, she paused, unsure whether to step down or offer more details. The mayor, a thoughtful man named Roger, leaned forward and asked how she planned to fund such an operation. Lauren's throat tightened. She explained the nonprofit structure she hoped to establish, though she admitted she didn't yet know all the specific legal requirements. She talked about potential grants, community partnerships, and small contributions from residents who were able to pay something. She acknowledged the enormous challenge ahead without shying away from it. When she finished speaking, the room remained silent for one breathless moment, then another, before the mayor nodded thoughtfully. He asked whether the house had already been inspected for code compliance after the recent repairs. Several volunteers in the audience confirmed that basic inspections had passed. He asked about fire safety. Clayton, the engineer who had overseen the installation of some interior improvements, stood and explained that they had installed smoke detectors and cleared emergency exits in the stone corridors. One by one, the people in the room, ordinary residents, shop owners, teachers, retirees, began voicing cautious support. Questions arose, but none felt hostile. Most seemed concerned with logistics rather than ideology. A few offered suggestions or contacts who might help Lauren navigate the nonprofit formation process. Hazel spoke passionately about the need for such a resource in their community. By the time the discussion wound down, something remarkable had happened. The town council took an informal show of hands, and the support for her proposal was nearly unanimous. Lauren left the town hall shaking, barely able to process what had just occurred. Eli grabbed her hand and squeezed it with excitement, and she allowed herself a rare moment of unfiltered joy. For the first time since finding the house, she felt that her vision was not only possible, but welcomed. The weeks that followed transformed that support into momentum. With help from Patricia, the head of the Historical Society and a woman with a near magical knack for navigating paperwork, Lauren filed for nonprofit status under the name the Flynn Mountain Refuge. Volunteers returned to furnish the rooms with donated beds, dressers, lamps, and quilts. Families who had upgraded their own homes brought gently used furniture, offering pieces that carried their own histories into the revived refuge. Hazel helped sort the donations, turning clutter into comfort. Lauren felt overwhelmed watching strangers walk through the house, carrying armchairs, end tables, and lampshades, making the barren rooms come alive. The transformation wasn't simply physical. It was emotional. It was communal. It was evidence that hope, once seeded, grew in ways that could never be predicted. By May, the refuge was ready for its first residents. The selection process required care and discretion. The social worker, who had become increasingly involved, Michael Torres, a calm and warm-voiced man who had spent years working with families in crisis, helped Lauren prepare a system that balanced compassion with structure. The refuge would house up to 3 families at any given time. Stays could last up to 6 months, depending on need and progress. Residents would sign a simple agreement outlining their responsibilities, keeping their rooms clean, participating in weekly community meetings, helping with meal preparation, and assisting in general upkeep of the house. If they were able to contribute financially, even a small amount, it would go into a communal fund used for groceries and utilities. If not, they would contribute through labor and participation. Lauren's stomach fluttered nervously the morning the first family arrived. The young couple Emma and Jonah had lost their cabin and nearly all their belongings in a winter house fire earlier that year. They arrived with a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket, looking weary but relieved to step into a space that felt safe and welcoming. Lauren led them to one of the larger mountain-carved rooms, newly furnished with a crib and a queen bed. The couple cried openly as they thanked her. Their gratitude felt like a tangible weight that settled into Lauren's heart, steadying her sense of purpose. Soon after, the second room was filled by a single father named Brent and his 2 daughters. They had been living in their truck for weeks after losing their apartment due to layoffs at the local construction company. The girls were 12 and 9, bright-eyed despite their ordeal. They gasped with delight when they saw their room 2 twin beds with matching quilts, a small desk, and a window overlooking the pine forest. Lauren watched as Brent stood silent for a moment, swallowing hard against his emotions before whispering a quiet thank you that seemed to shake him to his core. It didn't take long for the house to develop a rhythm. Breakfasts became communal, with residents taking turns making oatmeal, eggs, or pancakes, depending on what they had. Dinners were shared in the main room near the central stone corridor, where they pushed together several donated tables until it resembled a long dining hall. Children's laughter filled the spaces that had once echoed with abandonment. The house felt alive in ways Lauren couldn't have imagined earlier that winter. Eli thrived in this new environment. He played with the other children, helped younger ones with homework, and proudly showed visitors the stone corridors he knew by heart. Watching him blossom made Lauren's heart swell with gratitude. This was the life she had hoped to give him, a life with community, stability, and belonging. Michael visited weekly to check on the families, offering guidance on job applications, budgeting, and strategies for securing long-term housing. The families responded well to his quiet, steady presence. Under his direction, Brent began applying to construction jobs in neighboring counties and soon landed a position that aligned with his skills. Emma and Jonah received assistance from a relief fund that specialized in supporting fire-displaced families. Slowly, their savings grew. Their confidence grew, and with it, Lauren felt her own confidence deepening. By early summer, the refuge had become known throughout the region. Small articles appeared in local newspapers. A radio station interviewed Lauren, giving her the chance to speak about the legacy of Dr. Flynn and the revived refuge now carrying her name. Donations increased: food, clothing, toiletries, furniture, and financial contributions that helped sustain daily operations. The board of directors expanded to include Patricia, Michael, and a representative from the county social services office. Together, they met monthly in the old common room to discuss progress, concerns, and long-term plans. Despite the success, Lauren never allowed herself to become complacent. She stayed busy, learning to manage schedules, budgets, paperwork, and maintenance issues. She often felt pulled in many directions, but the house anchored her. Its stone walls grounded her. She no longer felt adrift in her life. Instead, she felt tethered to a purpose that was larger than her fears. Yet she never forgot where she had started. She still slept in the carved servants' quarters on the ground floor with Eli, a cozy 3-room apartment created from the most naturally insulated part of the refuge. She cherished every moment she tucked her son into his bed, knowing he no longer had to fall asleep in a cold van. She still took evening walks along the narrow mountain path to remind herself of the journey that had brought her here, and every so often, she would return to the journal she kept in her office drawer. The pages remained a beacon of strength, a reminder that one woman's determination could echo across decades. The year continued its slow progression. Families came and went. Each departure filled the house with a mixture of pride and melancholy, for their leaving meant success, but also farewell. Emma and Jonah found a new rental cottage not far from town. Brent and his daughters moved into a small duplex, much closer to his new workplace. Before leaving, each family wrote their names in a leather-bound journal Lauren had designated as the modern counterpart to Dr. Flynn's record. Their entries documented not just their time in the house, but the life they rebuilt because of it. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after everyone had gone to bed, Lauren would read those entries with a deep, humbling sense of awe. The mountain refuge had not only sheltered her and Eli, it had given her a calling. She never could have predicted that a forgotten house sold at a tax auction would become the center of her life, but now she could not imagine any other future. On the 1-year anniversary of the day she had walked into the county building and placed that unlikely bid, Lauren stood on the new front steps of the renovated porch. The evening air carried the scent of pine and the faint sweetness of early summer. The sun dipped slowly behind the mountain peaks, casting the refuge in a warm amber glow. Eli stood beside her, licking the last drops of ice cream from his cone, and leaned comfortably against her side. Around them, the house hummed with life. A family inside prepared dinner. Children laughed in the playroom. Soft music drifted from one of the bedrooms. The windows glowed with the warm light of lamps and lanterns. The refuge looked whole now, reborn, steady, strong. Lauren breathed deeply, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. She thought about everything that had led her here. The fear, the desperation, the sleepless nights in a freezing van. The volunteers who had become friends, the strangers who had turned into community, and the courage she hadn't known she possessed until necessity forced her to uncover it. She whispered a quiet thank you to the house, to the mountain, to Dr. Flynn, and to the version of herself who had refused to surrender even when the world felt impossibly heavy. Her gratitude was a soft prayer carried away by the wind. The refuge would continue. It would help families for years to come. It would stand in the mountain not as a relic of the past, but as a living testament to resilience, compassion, and the extraordinary power of a second chance. Lauren had kept the promise, the house protected again, and in doing so, it had given her not just a purpose, but a home. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and check out the next stories on the channel, and feel free to share this video with others. It really helps support the channel.